In space, mercy is the only thing that can't be measured, until it costs you your last breath. The sky was already crowded before he noticed it, dark silhouettes drifting across the thin upper atmosphere like silent predators, their hulls reflecting the pale light of a dying star, hundreds of them moving in perfect formation without a single transmission reaching the surface. And Ethan Cole didn't know who they were looking for, only that it wasn't him. Not a maintenance tech crawling through the skeleton of an abandoned oxygen refinery on a planet no one bothered to name, his boots scraping against frost-covered metal as the wind forced its way through broken seams, carrying a dry, metallic hiss that settled in his throat like sand, his visor flickering as the internal readout pulsed in sharp red numbers. Oxygen, 6%, and dropping, each breath slower than the last, each inhale thinner, like the air itself had decided to leave before he did. And somewhere above, those ships held position, waiting, watching, patient in a way only something powerful could afford to be. Ethan braced a hand against the wall, steadying himself as the station groaned under thermal stress, the temperature outside hovering near -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. But the cold wasn't what would take him. It was the silence between breaths, the growing gap where air should have been. He checked the tank mounted to his back, the last one, scratched, dented, barely holding pressure. The regulator whining softly like it knew it didn't have much left to give. He let out a slow exhale and adjusted the valve, conserving what little remained, calculating distance, shelter, survival, all the things that used to matter before he noticed the signal, faint, irregular, almost lost in the interference, a distress ping repeating every few seconds from somewhere deeper inside the structure. Not automated, not a beacon, something alive, or at least trying to be. Ethan hesitated, eyes drifting back to the sky beyond the fractured ceiling. The ships hadn't moved, not an inch, as if they were anchored to the moment itself. And for a second, just a second, he considered ignoring it, following protocol, preserving oxygen, preserving himself, because that's what you did out here. You survived first and asked questions later. But the signal came again, weaker this time, uneven, like a heartbeat skipping steps, and he closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than logic. His boots turned toward the source before his mind caught up, each step deliberate, heavier than it should have been, the corridor narrowing as frost thickened along the walls, until he saw her, half buried against a collapsed support beam, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest, her skin a dim, fading blue that pulsed weakly under the surface, like light struggling through deep water, her breathing shallow, erratic, the air around her barely sustaining life. And when her eyes opened, they didn't widen in fear or relief, just confusion, like she hadn't expected anyone to come at all. Ethan stopped a few feet away, the soft hiss of his own oxygen filling the space between them, the tank on his back suddenly feeling heavier than anything he had ever carried. And for the first time since the ships appeared, he understood something simple and absolute. Whatever they were waiting for, it had already begun. The hiss of his oxygen regulator grew louder in the silence between them, like a ticking clock that refused to slow down, and Ethan could feel every second slipping through him as he stepped closer, boots crunching lightly over frost that had settled like dust across the floor, his visor dimming at the edges as the system tried to conserve power. And still those eyes stayed on him, not pleading, not afraid, just watching, as if she was measuring something he could not see, her breathing uneven, each inhale shallow and delayed, her chest barely rising beneath the thin layer of fabric that looked more like a second skin than clothing. Something engineered, something precise, but failing now in this thin, broken atmosphere. Ethan lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the cold metal floor, the chill pressing through the suit, grounding him in a way the thinning air no longer could, his gloved hand hovering near the valve of his tank, hesitating just long enough for logic to catch up, just long enough to remind him that this was the last one, that once it was gone there would be no correction, no second attempt, no rescue beacon strong enough to reach orbit through the interference above. And yet the signal that had led him here pulsed again, weaker now, fading, as if whatever system had been keeping her alive was finally giving up, and he exhaled slowly, fogging the inside of his visor for a brief second before the suit cleared it away. "Hey," he said, his voice rough, quieter than he expected, as if the air itself did not want to carry sound anymore. "Stay with me." The words felt strange, unnecessary, but he said them anyway, because silence felt worse. Her gaze shifted slightly, focusing on him with effort, and when she spoke, it was not a language he recognized. At first, soft, melodic, layered with tones his translator struggled to process, until it finally resolved into something close enough to understand. "You are losing air," she said, the words slow, deliberate, like each one cost her something. Ethan gave a faint, almost amused breath that did not quite become a laugh. "Yeah," he replied, glancing at the readout again. "Oxygen. For percent, I noticed." His hand moved then, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, fingers closing around the connector at the base of his tank, the mechanism stiff from the cold as he twisted it free, the seal breaking with a sharp, final click that seemed louder than anything else in the room. And immediately the flow to his own system dropped, the pressure in his suit shifting as the backup reserve struggled to compensate. Thin, insufficient, temporary, he leaned forward and aligned the output with the intake port along her collar, the interface adjusting automatically as if it recognized the design, a soft chime, confirming connection, and then the flow began, a steady stream of oxygen transferring from him to her, her body reacting almost instantly. The faint blue beneath her skin brightening in slow pulses, like a light returning after a long outage, her breathing deepening, stabilizing, while his grew shorter, sharper, each inhale a little less satisfying than the last, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound the quiet exchange of life between two systems that were never meant to connect, until her eyes widened slightly, something shifting behind them, something closer to realization than confusion. "Why?" she asked, her voice stronger now, clearer. "Why would you do this?" Ethan leaned back just enough to see her fully, his vision already narrowing at the edges, the world losing color, losing detail, but her face remained sharp, steady, like it refused to fade with everything else, and he shrugged, a small, almost careless motion that cost more energy than it should have, because you needed it. He said simply, no explanation, no justification, just the truth as he understood it. And somewhere above them, unseen but not unfelt, the ships in the sky shifted for the first time. The first thing Ethan noticed was the sound, not loud, not sudden, but different. A low vibration that seemed to travel through the metal beneath his hand and into his bones, subtle at first, like the station itself was breathing again after years of silence. And somewhere above, far beyond the broken ceiling and the frozen air, something massive had changed position. He could not see it, not from here, but he felt it. The way you feel a storm before it arrives, the pressure shifting, the atmosphere tightening around an unseen center. His vision flickered, edges dimming further as the oxygen in his own system dropped below what his body needed. Each breath now shallow and unsatisfying, his chest rising but not quite filling. And still the flow continued from his tank into hers, steady, unwavering, her color returning more fully now, the blue beneath her skin no longer faint but vibrant, almost luminous in the dim light, her breathing deep and controlled, a stark contrast to his. She pushed herself up slowly, movements careful but no longer weak, and for a moment she simply looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time not as a stranger but as something she needed to understand. "You are fading," she said, her voice no longer strained, now clear, measured, carrying a weight that had not been there before. Ethan let out a thin breath that almost turned into a cough. "That was kind of the deal," he replied, his words slower now, each one taking effort, his gloved hand slipping slightly against the floor as he shifted his weight, the world tilting just a fraction, enough to make him aware that his body was beginning to lose the quiet fight it had been holding. She reached toward him then, not abruptly, not urgently, but with a deliberate precision, her fingers hovering near his visor as if unsure whether to touch. "You're kind," she said softly. "You calculate survival. You preserve your own." There was no accusation in her tone, only confusion, as if the equation no longer balanced. Ethan managed a faint smile behind the visor, unseen but present in the slight lift of his voice. Most of us do, he admitted, just not all the time. Her gaze shifted, just for a second, upward, toward the unseen sky. And something in her expression changed again, something deeper, older, recognition layered with something that felt almost like responsibility. The vibration in the station grew stronger, not violent, not destructive, but undeniable now, a presence pressing down from above, and faintly, through the fractured structure, a light began to filter in, not from the star, not from the environment, but from something moving across the sky, casting shadows that shifted in slow, deliberate patterns. Ethan followed it with his eyes as best he could, though his focus was slipping, the shapes blurring together, massive forms eclipsing the pale glow overhead. Guess your friends showed up, he murmured, though he did not know why he said it. Only that the timing felt too precise to be coincidence. She did not answer immediately, her attention still fixed on the sky, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tone that had not been there before, not softness, not weakness, but something closer to command, held tightly beneath control. They were not searching for you, she said, her eyes lowering back to him, steady, unwavering. They were searching for me. The words settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, and for the first time since he had seen the ships, Ethan understood that whatever he had stepped into was far larger than a broken station or a failing tank. His vision dimmed further, the light narrowing to a tunnel centered on her face, still clear, still impossibly sharp against the fading world. And as the last steady stream of oxygen left his tank, the sky above them shifted again, no longer waiting, no longer watching, but beginning to act. The connection between them did not break, even as the last of the oxygen drained from Ethan's tank, the soft chime fading into silence as the system completed its transfer. And for a brief moment the station felt impossibly still, as if the universe itself had paused to acknowledge the exchange. Ethan's chest rose again, but the breath that followed was thinner, weaker, barely enough to hold him in place, his fingers tightening slightly against the frozen floor as instinct tried to fight what logic already understood. The numbers inside his visor blinked once. Oxygen. 0%, before the display dimmed to a warning glow. And yet he did not panic, not fully, because something else had taken hold of the moment, something larger than survival. The light above them intensified, no longer distant or diffused, but focused, beams cutting through the fractured ceiling in clean, geometric lines, illuminating the interior of the station within. Artificial daylight that carried no warmth, only precision. Lyra stood now without hesitation, her posture straight, her movements no longer cautious but exact, as if the weakness he had seen moments before had never truly belonged to her. The glow beneath her skin pulsed brighter, synchronized with something unseen above, and when she reached down toward him again, there was no uncertainty this time, her hand resting lightly against the surface of his helmet, not to remove it, not to interfere, but to feel, to confirm. Ethan's vision narrowed further, her outline framed by the descending light, the rest of the world fading into shadow. You should not have done this, she said, but the words carried no regret, only a quiet recognition. Ethan let out a shallow breath that barely fogged the inside of his visor before dissipating. Yeah, he managed, voice slower now, edges soft. I get that a lot. The corners of her mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to suggest she understood more than she had before. Above them, the vibration resolved into structure, a low hum that filled the air as one of the ships adjusted its position directly overhead, its presence now undeniable, vast enough to block out the distant star completely, casting a defined shadow across the station's interior. And then, with a smooth precision that felt almost surgical, a column of light descended fully, enclosing them both in a controlled field that pushed back the cold, stabilized the air, and introduced something new into the environment, something Ethan could feel even through the failing systems of his suit, a pressure, subtle but growing, like the return of something his body had been missing. His breathing hitched, still weak, still insufficient, but no longer empty. Lyra's eyes lifted briefly toward the source, acknowledging it not with surprise, but with expectation. and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same quiet. Authority, no longer hidden. Stand down perimeter, she said, the words directed upward, precise, absolute. And though Ethan could not hear a response, he felt it, the hum shifting, the tension in the air easing just enough to signal compliance. She looked back at him then, her focus narrowing entirely, the vast machinery above reduced to background, irrelevant compared to the single human lying before her. You gave without knowing, she said softly, her hand still resting against his helmet. Without rank, without reason, without guarantee. Ethan tried to respond, but the words did not form, his body prioritizing breath over speech, the world dimming again at the edges, but her voice cut through it, steady, anchoring. That is not weakness, she continued. That is something my people forgot a long time ago. The light around them intensified once more, not blinding, but encompassing. And as the first controlled stream of breathable air began to cycle through the field, thin at first, then gradually increasing, Ethan felt it. The difference, the smallest shift from nothing to something, enough to hold on to, enough to stay. And for the first time since he had made the choice, survival returned not as a calculation, but as a consequence. The air inside the field did not rush in all at once. It grew, slow and deliberate, like something being remembered rather than created. Each breath Ethan took still shallow but no longer empty, his chest rising with a fragile rhythm that felt unfamiliar after the silence that had come before. The inside of his visor cleared fully now, the warning indicators fading into softer tones as the suit recalibrated to the new environment. And for a moment he simply lay there, eyes half open, watching the light bend around her silhouette. Lyra did not move away, her hand still resting against his helmet, not applying pressure, just there, as if maintaining a connection that had already been established, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that was no longer analytical, no longer distant, but something closer to recognition, as if she had crossed a threshold she could not step back from. Above them the low hum shifted again, resolving into patterns that almost resembled language, not spoken, but structured, layered signals moving between the ships and the field surrounding them. Ethan could not understand it, but he could feel the coordination, the precision of something vast responding to a single presence. Her presence. He swallowed slowly, the motion dry but possible now, and turned his head slightly, enough to glance upward through the fractured ceiling where the underside of the nearest vessel hovered, impossibly large, its surface smooth and seamless, reflecting no light, absorbing it instead. You have a lot of backup, he said, the words coming slower than usual, but steadier than before. Lyra followed his gaze for a brief moment, then looked back at him. They are not here for conflict, she replied, her tone calm, controlled. They are here because I was lost. The simplicity of the statement settled in the space between them, and Ethan let out a faint breath that almost resembled a laugh, though it carried no strength behind it. That is one way to get picked up, he murmured, his hand shifting slightly against the floor, testing his own weight, the strength returning in small, measured increments. Lyra's expression shifted again, subtle, but present, as if his attempt at humor had introduced something unexpected into the moment, something her systems had not predicted. She withdrew her hand then, not abruptly, but with intention, and stood fully upright within the field, her posture aligning with something unseen above, the light responding to her movement, adjusting, narrowing slightly as if centering on her position. Ethan Cole, she said, and the fact that she spoke his full name made him pause, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he looked up at her. You did not ask who I was, she continued. You did not ask what I would become once I could breathe again. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the air settle in his lungs before answering. Did not seem like it would change the part where you needed help, he said, his voice still quiet, but carrying a steadiness that had not been there before. Lyra studied him for a long second, the silence stretching, not uncomfortable, but full, as if something was being decided beyond words. Then she turned slightly, her gaze lifting once more toward the ship above, and when she spoke again, her voice carried outward, no longer directed at him alone. Prepare descent corridor, she said, the command clear, absolute, and immediately the light shifted, expanding outward, the field widening, stabilizing further, the air within it thickening to a level that felt almost natural. Ethan drew in a deeper breath this time, the first one that did not feel like a compromise, and closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, letting the sensation anchor him. When he opened them again, the ceiling above was no longer just fractured metal and distant sky. It had become a gateway, a controlled opening where the light extended upward into the waiting ship, a path being formed not for extraction alone, but for something more deliberate, more significant. And as Lyra looked back at him one more time, there was no distance left in her gaze, only certainty, as if whatever came next had already been decided the moment he chose to give rather than keep the corridor of light stabilized into something more than illumination. It became structure, a defined pathway extending upward through the fractured ceiling, edges clean and unwavering, as if space itself had been reshaped to allow passage. And Ethan could feel the difference immediately, not just in the air that now filled his lungs with increasing ease, but in the subtle shift of gravity around him, the weight on his body lightening just enough to make movement possible again. He drew in a deeper breath, slower this time, controlled, testing the limits of what had been returned to him, and then he pushed himself up, one hand against the cold metal floor, the other bracing against his knee, the motion unsteady but real, his legs responding after a brief hesitation, the weakness still there, but no longer overwhelming. Lyra watched him without interruption, her posture composed, her presence centered within the field as if everything around them adjusted in response to her rather than the other way around. "You are recovering," she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Ethan nodded once, his head still slightly heavy. "Feels like it," he replied, glancing down at his suit where the indicators had shifted from critical red to a steady amber. Not safe, but stable. For now he straightened slowly, his gaze drifting upward along the column of light, following its path into the waiting ship above, the scale of it clearer now, the underside stretching far beyond what his eyes could fully take in, smooth surfaces broken only by faint lines of energy that pulsed in rhythm with the field around them. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice steadier, though still quiet. Lyra stepped forward then, closing the small distance between them, her movements precise, each step aligned with the unseen geometry of the field. "Now," she said, "you are no longer outside the system." The phrasing caught his attention, not rescue, not evacuation, something else, something more deliberate. He frowned slightly, processing. "That sounds like a polite way of saying I am involved," he said. Lyra's eyes held his, unwavering. "You made yourself involved the moment you gave what you could not replace," she answered, her tone calm, but absolute. Above them the hum shifted again, deeper this time, resonant, as if acknowledging her statement, and then new shapes moved within the light, not descending rapidly, but forming gradually, platforms of translucent energy extending downward in layered steps, creating a path that was no longer abstract but tangible, something he could walk if he chose to. Ethan looked at it, then back at her, the implication clear. "You are taking me up there," he said, not quite a question. Lyra inclined her head slightly. "You cannot remain here," she replied. "This environment is no longer relevant to your survival." He let out a small breath, considering that, the broken station around them, the freezing wind beyond the field, the empty corridors that had offered nothing but slow suffocation. And then he looked back up at the ship, at the scale of it, the unknown it represented, and for a moment, just a moment, hesitation returned, not fear, but awareness of crossing a boundary that could not be uncrossed. Lyra seemed to sense it, her gaze softening just enough to acknowledge the weight of the decision. "You chose without knowing," she said quietly. "You can choose again, this time with understanding." Ethan studied her for a long second, the memory of that first moment still clear, the fading signal, the choice that had not felt like a choice at all. And then he exhaled slowly, a steady breath this time, and gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said, "I am not great at turning back once I start something." The faintest shift in her expression suggested approval, or something close to it, and she turned toward the ascending path, stepping onto the first platform of light without hesitation, pausing just long enough to look back at him, not commanding, not insisting, simply waiting. And after a brief moment, Ethan followed, his boots making no sound as they met the surface, the light holding firm beneath his weight. And as they began to rise, leaving the broken station behind, the sky above did not feel distant anymore. It felt like a destination that had already been decided the moment he chose to give instead of keep. The ascent was smoother than Ethan expected, the platform beneath his boots carrying him upward without vibration, without sound, as if motion itself had been refined into something invisible. The broken station shrinking below them with each passing second, its jagged edges and frost-covered corridors fading into a quiet, forgotten shape against the barren surface, and above, the underside of the ship opened not with doors, but with absence, a section of its structure dissolving into light just long enough to receive them, then reforming seamlessly once they passed through, enclosing them in an environment that felt immediately different, not just warmer, but controlled, in a way that made the outside world feel distant and unreal. The air here was clean, balanced, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible hum that resonated through the floor and into his chest, syncing with his breathing in a way that steadied it further. Ethan took a slow step forward as the platform dissolved beneath his feet, leaving him standing on a surface that looked solid but reflected no light, matte and perfect, stretching outward into a vast interior that curved gently upward at the edges, giving the sense that the entire space was part of something much larger than what he could see. Lyra moved ahead without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer blending into the environment but defining it. And as she stepped forward, the space responded, lines of soft illumination appearing along the floor in front of her, guiding her path without being commanded. Ethan followed a few steps behind, his eyes moving constantly, taking in details his mind struggled to categorize, structures that were not quite walls, not quite machinery, surfaces that shifted subtly as if adapting to unseen inputs. "This is not what I expected," he said quietly, his voice carrying farther here than it had below, the acoustics controlled but not dampened. Lyra glanced back at him briefly. "Expectation is based on familiarity," she replied. "This is not a familiar place." He let out a faint breath that almost formed a smile. "That is one way to put it," he said, continuing forward. And then the space ahead of them changed, the floor widening into an open chamber, the curved walls rising higher. And at the center, a structure formed, not descending, but assembling itself from streams of light, shapes aligning, solidifying into a raised platform that felt less like a piece of equipment and more like a focal point, something designed to be seen, to be approached. Lyra stopped at its edge, her presence triggering another subtle shift in the environment. The light intensifying slightly, the hum deepening in tone, and then, from the surrounding space, figures emerged, not walking, not appearing suddenly, but resolving into visibility as if they had always been there, tall, composed, their forms distinct yet unified by the same underlying design, their attention directed entirely toward her, not Ethan, not the space around them, only her. And for the first time since entering the ship, Ethan felt something close to tension, not fear, but awareness of hierarchy, of structure, of a system that operated on rules far beyond his understanding. Lyra stepped forward onto the central platform, her movement precise, deliberate, and as she did, every other figure lowered slightly, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to signal acknowledgement, respect, something formal and deeply ingrained. Ethan remained where he was, just outside the central space, unsure if stepping forward would break something he could not see. And then Lyra spoke, her voice carrying across the chamber, clear, controlled. "Status," she said, a single word, but it held weight, authority that reshaped the air around it. One of the figures responded, their tone layered, harmonized in a way that suggested more than one voice speaking as one. "Primary objective secured. All sectors stabilized. No external threats detected." Ethan listened, piecing together what he could, the words familiar, the meaning larger than their simplicity suggested. And then Lyra turned, her gaze finding him again, and in that moment, the distance between them shifted, not physically, but in something less visible, something that made it clear he was no longer just an observer. "Ethan Cole," she said, her voice softer now, but no less certain. You are no longer a variable in this system. He frowned slightly, processing. That sounds important. He replied, and she held his gaze for a second longer before answering. Means you are under my protection now. The words settled in the space between them, quiet, absolute, and around them. The entire chamber seemed to accept it without question, as if the decision had already been integrated into something far larger than either of them alone. The chamber did not erupt in reaction. It absorbed the declaration, the words settling into the structure around them as if they had always been part of its design, and Ethan felt it more than he saw it. A subtle recalibration in the space, the attention of every figure shifting, no longer fixed solely on Lyra but expanding just enough to include him, not as an equal, not yet, but as something acknowledged, something placed within a defined boundary. He stood still for a moment, letting that realization settle, the weight of it unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. Under your protection, he repeated quietly, testing the phrase as if it might change depending on how it was said. Lyra stepped down from the central platform, the light beneath her feet responding instantly, forming a path back toward him, her presence no longer elevated above the others, but still unmistakably central to everything that moved. It is not a symbolic statement, she said, stopping a few feet in front of him, her voice steady, direct. It is a structural change. Ethan glanced briefly around the chamber again, at the figures that had resumed their positions, at the subtle motion of the environment adjusting in ways he could not fully track, and then back at her. I figured it was not just for show, he replied, a faint edge of dry humor returning to his tone, though softer now, more measured. Lyra regarded him for a second longer, then turned slightly, gesturing toward a section of the chamber that had not been visible before, the surface there shifting, opening into a new space that extended beyond the main hall. You will need stabilization, she said. Your physiology has been compromised by the atmospheric loss. Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding once. Yeah, that tracks, he said, taking a step forward as the new corridor formed, the floor adjusting beneath his boots to guide his movement. The air here even more refined, carrying a balance that felt almost tailored, as if the system had already begun adapting to him specifically. He followed her into the newly open space, the transition seamless, the chamber behind them closing without sound, and ahead, the environment shifted again, becoming more contained, more focused, the walls closer, the light softer, centered around a structure that resembled a platform, but with a precision that suggested function rather than design. Lyra stopped beside it, turning to face him fully. Lie down, she said, not as an order, but as a necessary step. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of distrust, but out of habit, the instinct to remain upright, aware, in control. But that instinct felt distant now, replaced by a quiet understanding that he had already crossed every line that would have justified caution. He lowered himself onto the surface, the material adjusting instantly to his weight, conforming just enough to support him without restriction. The moment his body settled, the system responded, faint lines of light tracing along the edges, scanning, measuring, adapting. He felt a subtle warmth spread through the suit, not external heat, but something internal, stabilizing, aligning. His breathing deepened again, smoother now, the strain finally beginning to fade from his chest. He closed his eyes briefly, not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being fully supported in an environment that was not his own. You said I am not a variable anymore, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more reflective. Lyra remained beside him, her presence constant, her gaze steady. Correct, she replied. Ethan opened his eyes again, looking up at the ceiling that did not quite look like a ceiling, its surface shifting in patterns too complex to follow. So what does that make me? He asked, the question simple, but carrying more weight than he intended. Lyra did not answer immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to suggest that the answer mattered. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. It makes you someone this system must account for, she said, and in the quiet that followed, Ethan realized that for the first time since he had stepped onto this planet, he was no longer trying to survive the environment. The environment had begun to adjust to him. The system did not rush. It refined. each second layering subtle corrections into Ethan's body. The platform beneath him adjusting in ways too precise to feel directly, yet undeniable in their effect, his breathing now steady, deep, the tightness in his chest replaced by a calm rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar after everything that had come before. The suit's indicators shifted to neutral tones, no longer warning, no longer compensating, simply observing. And for the first time since the crash, since the station, since the moment he saw the signal, there was no immediate threat pressing against him, only quiet, controlled stability. He stared upward, watching the ceiling as it responded to his presence, patterns shifting slowly, almost thoughtfully, like something studying him in return. Lyra remained at his side, not intervening, not directing, simply there. Her posture relaxed in a way that suggested the system around them required no further correction. "Your oxygen saturation is normalized," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, no longer carrying the sharp edge of command. Ethan let out a slow breath, almost testing it, and nodded slightly. "Feels like it," he replied, his voice clearer than it had been since before the station. He shifted his arm, then his shoulders, testing movement, strength returning fully, not enhanced, not altered, just restored, and somehow that felt more significant than anything else. Lyra watched the small adjustments, her gaze attentive but not intrusive, as if confirming that what had been given back was exactly what had been taken, no more, no less. "This system," Ethan said after a moment, his eyes still on the shifting surface above, "it adapts fast." Lyra inclined her head slightly. "It is designed to preserve what is deemed necessary," she replied. Ethan turned his head just enough to look at her. "And I am necessary now," he said, not as a question, but as something he was still getting used to hearing out loud. Lyra held his gaze, steady, unwavering. "You are accounted for," she answered, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. Ethan exhaled quietly, letting that settle, not trying to analyze it further, not trying to define it, just accepting it for what it was. After a few seconds, he pushed himself up from the platform, this time without hesitation, his body responding fully, balanced, stable. He stood there for a moment, taking in the space again, but it felt different now, not because the ship had changed, but because he had, not physically, not in any measurable way, but in how the environment responded to him, how it included him without resistance. Lyra stepped back slightly, giving him space without stepping away entirely, her presence still close enough to anchor the moment. "What happens to me now?" Ethan asked, his voice calm, no urgency behind it, just quiet curiosity. Lyra considered him for a brief second, and then her gaze shifted past him, towards something only she could see, something integrated into the system at a level he could not access. "That depends," she said, returning her attention to him, "on what you choose to become within it." Ethan let out a faint breath that almost turned into a smile, the kind that did not need to be seen to exist. "I was just trying to fix a broken relay," he said, more to himself than to her. Lyra's expression softened, just slightly. "And instead," she replied, "you changed a system that does not break." The words lingered in the air between them, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, like a truth that did not need to be emphasized. Ethan looked past her then, toward the unseen expanse beyond the chamber, toward the fleet that had once filled the sky and now waited in silence, aligned with something far greater than a single moment. And he realized, slowly, quietly, that nothing he had done had been large, not in scale, not in power. It had been small, a single choice, made without certainty, made without guarantee. And yet here he stood, breathing in air that was not his, inside a system that now knew his name. And for the first time, that felt like enough. He was not a hero, not a soldier, not anything the galaxy would remember. He had simply refused to walk away. And somewhere in the quiet structure of that ship, in the silent alignment of a fleet that had come for one and found two, that was all that had been required.